It's scary to think that in some ways, the leaders of the largest corporations on the globe may hold more power than elected officials. But luckily enough, we have the powers of government regulation.
Oh no. KnowledgeHub, what did you just do? So, KnowledgeHub generally is a decent source of information on YouTube when it comes to a layman's glance into historical events. Unlike the infographics show, he even tends to nail it on economic issues of the past. He made an entire series explaining the issues with prohibition laws. He even made a video about the Great Depression in which he properly blames the Federal Reserve manipulating interest rates as the cause of the financial crash, which is something most normie media gets wrong. I mean, his video isn't 100% perfect. He made some small errors, such as claiming that no economists had predicted the Great Depression, while Austrian economists throughout the entire previous decade had been warning people that the economy was in a bubble. But this is just a fucking travesty. This is worse than any flawed video put out by the infographic show altogether. So, on to the first point made by this video. This is a pet peeve of mine, something which is a legitimate issue in argumentation, but nonetheless irritates me beyond what it should. In relation to politics, the term power specifically refers to the ability to hold dominion over other people, one which naturally can't exist and only the state can have as a result of its monopoly on arbitration, enabling politicians to make up arbitrary decisions. It naturally can't exist because each individual has dominion over themselves, meaning that it would be impossible to demonstrate and can't be justified under even light scrutiny. But I digress. CEOs of private companies cannot and do not hold the same influence over a state society as politicians, and even the assertion that they can is a demonstrable absurdity, unless of course they choose to become politicians themselves, but you know what I mean. And you immediately contradicted yourself within the first 5 seconds of this video by demonstrating exactly what I just explained. So this isn't something which escaped you, rather something you seem to be consciously ignoring. Even more proof that this video wasn't created to attempt and illustrate a demonstrable problem regarding the nature of markets is the portrayal that government regulation is the government stepping in and heroically, for no other interest, keeping those evil, nasty private producers from taking over the world.
Of course!
That notion is contradicted by his previous video on prohibition laws.
ASL truly mastered the art of influencing mass media. It would function as a group that screamed the loudest, that fought the dirtiest, and would refuse to stop its goals. It would gain political allies through thinly veiled corruption. Basically, ASL would confront a politician, and if they agreed to join the cause, they would almost have a guaranteed spot in office. If they refused, they would nearly guaranteed lose the election. But this would start the downfall of the prohibition movement. Literally, just as it was starting. Business-savvy crime leaders saw opportunity in the passing of the act. The demand for alcohol would rise, and only those willing to operate outside the law would be willing to supply it. Some began to gather and collect alcohol in huge numbers as to sell it once the law would pass. As this illegal sale of alcohol became more fruitful, violence began to grow. Gang leaders became wealthy men, and this wealth brought power.
Not all regulation may bolster the prominence of crime syndicates specifically, but the economic effects of regulation are universal and undeniable. Whether it's a minimum wage increase, a mandated inspection period, or the outright ban by the state on private trade with a certain commodity. You create artificial scarcity because regulation increases the cost of production, in turn limiting the amount of competitors that can enter the market, and commodities which can be produced in a given industry. This will greatly lower the amount of jobs available, amount of producers on the market, will greatly increase the cost of commodities, and will lower the quality of the commodities on the market. And these are the problems regulations create, assuming that politicians and other political organizations aren't creating these regulations with a hidden agenda in mind, which more times than not is the case, since politicians have the direct incentive to implement welfare policies monopolies and monopolistic regulations on the market, since they create a state of dependence on the government by the general population, and artificially boost the approval ratings of politicians who implemented them, in turn giving them more brand recognition and influence. Not to mention that big corporations have a long history of advocating for government regulations on the economy because it kills competitors and allows them to curb the market. A few examples being McDonald's lobbying for increased FDA oversight on the production and trade of food, and Philip Morris lobbying for increased government regulation on tobacco products.
Ways of stopping uncontrollable enterprise from taking total control of society.
The irritating part of this video doesn't come from the use of emotional buzzwords as a substitute for substantive information as a means of manipulating the viewer into being led to conclusions which don't logically follow from what little information is presented, or the dishonest mischaracterizations which are rhetorically designed to mislead the viewer. Because really, this particular brand of pseudo-intellectualism is pretty common among anti-free market propaganda, as is to be expected considering that the ideas supported by anti-free marketers have been roundly debunked and have been demonstrated time and time again to not be valid. And while yes, it in of itself is frustrating, the irritating part here in particular comes from the fact that we know that KnowledgeHub is aware that he's fucking lying to people, since he's made videos in the past showing that increasing regulation is bad for the economy, and demonstrating why this is so. And his past claims didn't attempt to appeal to this tactic of using euphemisms to obscure what he's actually advocating for, and attempt to portray his ideas as being more neutral than they really are, and portray his opposing ideas as being worse or harder to justify than they really are without any backing reasoning. His previous videos were straightforward and explained exactly what happened and are based on well-documented historical precedent. It is functionally impossible for monopolies to form without a government coercing competitors out of the market, or manipulating price ratios, because any time an industry lacks competition in a free market, competitors are only incentivized to start producing in that specific trade. Since a monopoly would fundamentally be incapable of pricing commodities at a competitive rate, since, well, there's no competition in sight, and for the same reason, monopolies also lack quality in their service, since nothing would happen to them if they displeased their consumers. Competitors would easily enter, make better quality products than the one company that existed, and at a cheaper price. If you look at any monopoly which has ever existed in history, you will find that shortly before it came to be, there were government regulations imposed on that specific industry.
I mean, for the most part. But as bad as it may seem today, it used to be worse. Oh boy, yes sirree, was it worse. There was a time when the power of the United States was undoubtedly in the hands of a select few businessmen. The robber barons, the captains of industry. Call them what you like, but they controlled everything. This was a time of unprecedented growth, and sure, businesses had massive profits and power in years past, but nothing like this. Why? How? When? Who? Don't worry, Jimmy, your boy Tyler's got you covered, because today we're looking at the Gilded Age.
You gotta love how inept these anti-free marketers are, that the only examples they can ever give for a free market gone wrong are examples of periods where the state heavily interfered with the market by subsidizing up-and-coming industries, or outright outlawing competition in the case of the steamship industry during this period of time. And they do this for everything. The Great Depression, the housing crash, the dot-com bubble, the decline in real wage growth, net neutrality. I mean, how fucked do you have to be that all you can do is spread lies about how situations which were created by the very things you advocate for were created by things you oppose? I mean, there's nothing like it. At this point, even flat earthers have more credibility than the arguments for government regulation. At least the flat earth crowd doesn't take observations made by their critics which contradict their theories and present those observations as if they could only have happened if their theories were true, and revise history in order to construct this narrative. Now, Don't get me wrong, living in working conditions in the early industrial era, so the entire 19th century, were not ideal if observing from an anachronistic modern perspective, and even if the government hadn't interfered in the market like they did, a decent chunk of the 19th century still more than likely would have been spent in similar working conditions, since innovating past the aforementioned conditions would take a while. Granted, it wouldn't have taken as long, since more competition would have generated more capital and put more resources into the economy, which would have in turn drastically increased investment and savings rates. But there's a reason why, despite this, millions of people moved away from smaller towns into cities, or cities developed. That's because despite the idyllic, picturesque image of 18th century rural farm life that writers during the Industrial Revolution were creating, such as Charles Dickens or Mark Twain, working on a farm was far more dangerous than working in a factory at the time. On top of the machines, which were less stable and required the operators to put themselves into more positions where they could possibly be maimed or crushed, farm hands also had to work around dangerous farm animals, which were even less predictable. Regardless, it wasn't a pretty time to be alive for anyone, really, especially wage laborers. But to argue that living conditions were caused by exploitative business practice is inaccurate.
So, in the latter half of the 1800s, it was becoming quickly apparent that new technology would soon change everything. The Second Industrial Revolution. Earlier in the century, we saw some steamboats and we had some factories, but this was something more. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll be focusing on a select few titans of enterprise in this video rather than covering them all, because, yeah, there's a lot. So to get started, we'll go back to a fine young fellow, Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Oh my god, he's actually trying to argue that Vanderbilt was a monopolist. Alright, I'm genuinely curious. How are you going to try and go about spinning this one?
Born on Staten Island, New York, US of A, baby, in 1794. As a young man, he had access to one fine specimen of a ferry. How he got it, who knows. Some say he borrowed money, some say his dad had it. I really don't care. What matters is he made a living with this ferry. He took people from Staten Island all the way to Manhattan. People called him the Commodore because he was on a boat and whatnot. But that one boat soon turned into a fleet, and that fleet soon turned into a really, really big fleet. By this point, he's really wealthy.
Vanderbilt became wealthy by illegally competing with Robert Fulton, who in 1807 had used political ties to stop all steamboat traffic in the state of New York, which wasn't affiliated with his brand, for 30 years. That's right, the government literally outlawed competition, and you're saying that this was a product of the free market. Good lord. Anyway, Vanderbilt made it expressly clear that his motivation for entering the steamboat industry was to challenge this monopoly, because his company flew a flag on their ferries that read, quote, "New Jersey must be free." He also challenged the government legally on numerous occasions, like in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, where he helped a business partner, Thomas Gibbons, challenge the government's regulations and subsidies of the steamboat industry. He did the exact same thing when he entered the railroad industry. Because he wasn't a subsidized crony, Vanderbilt was easily able to price his products at a lower rate and provide better quality service than his competitors. Why? Because his competitors were corporatists, who in some cases had such an egregious hold of the market due to the state that Vanderbilt had to break the law to simply enter the market. Vanderbilt not only had nothing to do with cronyism, he outright despised the business practice, so much so that he was willing to be thrown in a cage by the state just to compete with the corporatists. And this is the guy who is a so-called robber baron. If anything, he has more in common with, well, it appears that even while consciously attempting not to reference him, the longest I can go without is 3 videos.
But he knew the future wasn't boats. He saw something else. The railroads. They weren't entirely new, but they were getting pretty popular. And by the time the Transcontinental Railroad was built, it was apparent that this was the next big industry. The importance of rail transportation is lost on many people these days. Back then, it was the only way to get across large distances in a modest time frame. Just as important, it allowed entrepreneurs to sell their products nationwide, something that would otherwise be basically impossible. As the products reach larger markets, profits increase, both for the producer and the guy who delivers it. So yeah, it's important. He starts selling his boats. All his boats. Puts the money into the rail industry. And soon the Commodore begins to witness the benefits of unyielding economic power. After all, the more profits you have gives you the more power to regulate your own prices, fairly or otherwise. Competition and customers are fed up with this pricing.
His competitors had state-enforced monopolies! Are you fucking kidding me right now? He didn't price his commodities at lower rates because he had a monopoly. His prices were the competitive rates, and his opponents were corporatists who, through either state subsidy, regulation, or having their competitors outlawed, were inefficient, couldn't price their commodities at competitive rates, and provided a lower quality of service, because unlike Vanderbilt, they had no incentive. Since they weren't dependent on their customers, either way, they were going to make ends meet because the government was giving them millions. You are literally defending the monopolists, which this video was designed to criticize, and claiming that competition with them is illegitimate. Fuck off, KnowledgeHub! And to quickly refute the argument which was briefly touched upon here, no, having more resources does not give a business a competitive advantage over smaller market entities. The problem here is that you aren't taking scale into consideration. To borrow this example from Filthy Heretic, say you have one business that makes $100 million annually, and another that only makes $100,000. If both of these companies were to cut their rates at 10%, the first business would lose $10 million, while the second would only lose $10,000. To put it simply, this isn't a financially viable decision and would only create a loss in revenue for the larger businesses. Hence why there isn't a single documented example of this ever happening, at least not without the state being involved in some manner.
Being pretty mean to him. Old Vanderbilt doesn't take kindly to this and literally stops all rail transport into and out of New York City. Just stops it. The opposition loses value as stocks drop, and Old Vanderbilt is right there to buy them up.
I found very little historical evidence to support this claim, but I find it doubtful at best considering that there was more than one company which owned railroads in New York City in the mid to late 19th century. Even if this did happen, however, he would have had to have signed a contract with other companies to let them use his railroads, then violated his contract in order to make this move, which companies could have easily filed a lawsuit since they'd be able to demonstrate direct damages to their company as a result of him violating the contract which he agreed to. So if this did happen, it was not because of Vanderbilt.
And all the while, more railways are built. Just tons of railways all over the place. Possibly too many. Actually, yes, definitely too many. Not much potential remains in the rail building industry since over the past few decades, enough seem to have been constructed.
Actually, railroads had stopped being built after the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 was passed, which made it so fewer competitors could enter the market and fewer railroads could be built.
So Vanderbilt wants a new revenue source. If he can't build more railways, what if he can find new cool things to put on those railways? Intriguing. What he finds is kerosene. Kerosene lets people just light lamps every night and gain the ability to see when it was previously dark. It was booming, and that popularity would soon take it from commodity to necessity, and Vanderbilt wanted in. So he gets a hold of an up-and-coming businessman, John D. Rockefeller.
Rockefeller is a mixed bag. Like Vanderbilt, he started off competing with a state-subsidized monopoly on crude oil by creating more efficient products that used kerosene. But unlike Vanderbilt, he went on to become the very same sort of corporatist that he started his career fighting against. Now, there's so much political corruption and connections with the state to go over regarding Rockefeller that seeps into so many different areas that it would warrant its own video altogether. together. So I unfortunately will not be covering all of them. However, if you want a source which does provide a good account of Rockefeller and how Standard Oil used the government to get rid of competition, I will put a link in the description to a documentary entitled How Big Oil Conquered the World by James Corbett. It's a really fascinating watch.
But it wasn't just America. No, it was everywhere. But right now, let's not look at everywhere, let's look at Canada. Canada had made unions illegal. Unions just fought for better rights and pay and stuff, and workers would strike if demands weren't met. Well, in 1872, Canada changes its mind and everybody's happy. Unions are legal. People parade on the streets, and every year they celebrate this with a labor parade. But I know what you're saying. Who cares? Let me talk, Jimmy, it's all gonna connect somehow. But let's get back to America for now. Well, all this fun comes to an end pretty quickly with the Panic of 1873. It's the worst economic debacle America has seen so far.
The Panic of 1873, similar to Tulip Mania, is a myth which never actually happened and is merely used to promote political agendas. The myth of Tulip Mania was promoted by religious fundamentalists to spread the idea that God punishes people for overreaching by causing plagues. From 1873 to 1879, the period of time which was affected by this supposed depression, the U.S. saw a 3% per annual increase in national product, a real national product growth of 6.8% per year, and an annual 4.5% growth in GDP. So it's obvious with this massive expansion of industry, output, net national product, and real per capita income, this depression never really happened. And seeing that propaganda like this seemed to be the only type spreading this information in politics, I think the agenda it's meant to spread is self-evident.
You can tell it's not all fun and or games. For some, it's actually none of these things. Thomas Scott has to shut down some of the railroads, lay some people off, cut wages, and people strike. Then militias are brought out to ease the tensions, and it's just a bad time all around. Worse yet, Thomas Scott dies soon after. Now, you may be asking, why are you talking about this Thomas Scott guy? Well, it's because he's a mentor to a very special somebody, a Scottish American named Andrew Carnegie.
Carnegie, much like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, started off competing with state monopolies and lowering the price of commodities in his specific industry since he was actually incentivized to serve his customers. And again, unlike Vanderbilt, Carnegie became a corporatist and lobbied for government regulation, like in the 1910s when the Carnegie Foundation created a commission that pressured the government to increase regulation on who could be an employee in the healthcare industry. Anyway, his section isn't too important since KnowledgeHub spends very little time talking about Carnegie. Instead, we move straight on to the union propaganda section, which every pro-regulation argument inevitably dives into. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that unions are a bad thing. I believe that they can be an efficient tool in telling producers how to competitively set their rates on hiring employees and how to draw more workers into their companies. However, I am against state-enforced union monopolies.
At the same time, those steel workers were going through the ringer. It wasn't uncommon for workers to just die.
Citation needed.
Now, that dam wasn't great, and it also was the only thing protecting a local town from certain devastation. They asked Frick to fix it up, and he was just like, nah. Being the amazing culmination of human evolution that he was, Frick decided to weaken the dam to make it easier to cross. Guess what? It broke and over 2,000 people died.
Oh no, who knew that when competition is restricted by the state or entities are subsidized directly by the government, people have less incentive? You know what? This entire section I've already basically debunked earlier in this video, so moving on. Also, the dam didn't break because it was deliberately weakened. It broke because of heavy flooding. It was simply neglected.
Carnegie was also a member of the club, and he probably felt pretty bad because right after he wrote a pretty compassionate work, The Gospel of Wealth. In this, he basically says rich people should give back to the communities and enrich the lives of the public instead of hoarding it in their Scrooge McDuck mansions.
What a dishonest way to describe the government stealing from people. Also, wealthy people don't hoard their money. They invest it into the economy. I mean, don't get me wrong, they do save their money as well, but that's a good thing since investment without saving creates false signals in the market that lead to financial crashes, which is what happens when you increase government spending in the private market. Yeah, so as you all may be able to tell, this is the point in the video where the bullshit meter gets cranked up as far as it can go.
This was appalling to other captains of industry. See, they relied on a different philosophy, social Darwinism.
How many fucking times does this straw man need to be debunked? Business philosophy is marginal, only relates to competition within that market, and is essentially limited to what producers think will net them the most gain out of their actions. Markets do not have a metaphysical belief system which motivates them. They are motivated by the self-interest of the producers which operate within them. But hey, you've resorted to emotional manipulation tactics this entire video because you don't have any actual facts on your side, so why should I expect any less than for you to collectivize people and then use divide and conquer tactics designed to otherize groups which you don't agree with. Plus, as I've pointed out earlier, big corporations have historically been in favor of regulation.
But it's not all whoop-de-doo fun times for our Gilded Age businessmen. You see, we're going into untested waters. A new era, the progressive era. Amongst other things, reform was pretty in. Workers were done waiting and the government tried to help, kinda. See, laws would be passed and just never followed through. If it was going to hurt a massive monopoly, might as well forget about those laws. Guess who's paying those congressmen and the government? Yes, those captains of industry, they basically did own the country.
Okay, so you admit that the government is causing the problem. Why are you blaming the market then?
You got the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. It tried to stop some anti-competitive pricing on railways,
which had the same effect on the market as the aforementioned Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. Alright, so it's becoming abundantly clear to me that this video seems to have pathetically shriveled up into a circular theme of pointing to things which the government did and blaming them on the market by omitting relevant information and outright fucking lying about it, or without presenting any information at all and just making baseless assertions, and by repeating the same points over and over again. I've refuted all of them by now, and you can feel free and watch the original to see for yourself. In conclusion, it's a sad day when a decent channel decides to fall prey to a political bias not rooted in any factual basis and starts spewing nonsensical, long-debunked propaganda. And just as a quick announcement, I didn't go into the progressive era much because I've been planning on making a video about it for some time actually, and seeing as this video completely misrepresented the progressive era, just making the same errors I've been debunking time and time again in the video, and the early progressive movement's agenda, my next video is going to be on the progressive era. And to Patreon supporters, I promise I'll upload the second part to my series on Konkin soon. I'm sorry I've been neglecting that, it's been hard to recreate that, and I feel like I'm walking on eggshells talking about it since it's partly the work of a man who I respect and died. Anyway, I will see you